So here's the cover of the book, and the cover starts with, essentially a play on what I just spoke about. That the typical Western construct of Plato's cave is that there is a single cave. There are people that have been chained, and they can only see these shadows on the wall, and here is a coronavirus. But that one of their lot escapes and goes up into the outside world in the sun, the social scientist or the philosopher or the epidemiologist, and then they come back and say, look, this is how things are going. They come back and bring objective truths to enlighten their locked fellows. But if you see things the way I do, in that there is, there is more work of interpretation being done. There's ideology built into the way we're curating our results. Then Plato's cave might look more like a warren, where there's no outside. There's just a lot of different there's a lot of different burrows that people can go to agree upon different ways of seeing social phenomena, different ways of parsing them. And this is essentially a pragmatist notion of truth that we get from William James and John Dewey on down. That truth, at least as far as social phenomena are concerned, is something that we come to agree upon. And the truths that we hold usually end up being truths that serve elite interests. And so the idea, in Habermasian fashion, is to create ideal speech situations where people with different interpretations actually have seats at the table. People without the PhDs or without the Harvard backing or without the voice clips in the New York Times, that their interpretations get a seat at the table. And oftentimes you'll see that they're equally valid ways of seeing the world, and ways that may have a focus more on justice than on perpetuating transnational relations of inequality. So just about my position, where I'm coming from. I mean, as a quote unquote anthropologist, my goal is not to go to places and represent what it's like to people's experience of epistemic violence. Rather, I'm using my experience in Partners in Health and Doctors Without Borders and Harvard and the WHO and World Bank and CDC and all these places that I've worked to kind of hold up a mirror to its participant observation, essentially, of how harmers do their harm. And a lot of this is based on the sort of moral presuppositions. And I think a lot of the aid industry and a lot of what goes on in global public health, it comes from the idea that we're morally related to people in the global South as potential saviors, as people to bring aid, as people to bring studies that help with adherence to HIV meds, these kind of things. But I don't think that many people see themselves as morally related to people in the global South as supporters and beneficiaries from a global institutional order that systematizes this oppression. And this is what coloniality is all about, that even after countries in the global South achieved independence after the period of colonialism, we moved into a period of coloniality where ways of dominating the economic sphere and the mental sphere of people in post-colonies continue to exist. So here's the definition. Coloniality can be described as the matrix of power relations that persistently manifest despite a former colony's achievement of nationhood. The framework attempts to capture the racial, political, economic, social, epistemological, linguistic, and gendered hierarchical orders imposed by European colonialism that transcended independence and continued to oppress in accordance with the needs of capital. Ramon Gross-Fogel has to say, the heterogeneous and multiple global structures that were put in place over 450 years did not evaporate with independence. We continue to live under the same colonial power matrix. With independence, we move from a period of global colonialism to global coloniality. And then Sabelo and Lovo from South Africa says, despite the celebration of decolonization as a milestone in African history, Africa has not managed to free itself from epistemological colonization, inscribed on the continent and its people by mission and secular schools, schools of medicine and schools of public health, religious denominations, and other institutions that carried Western cultural imperialism. And through the book, I go through different examples. The one I focus on that's published as an article in Medicine, Anthropology, and Theory is how a study by Harvard epidemiologists that came into DRC to kind of explain why that outbreak in 2018-19 was so large, how they actually carried Western cultural imperialism with them. They were not conducting sort of objectively neutral fact-finding. The results they came up with actually supported status quo relations of inequality and really gutted radical interventions. I think, to sum it up really quick, essentially their study published in Lancet Infectious Disease concluded that the outbreak was so big because people were believing in misinformation, and that they didn't believe Ebola was real, and that they didn't believe that or that Ebola was a bioweapon from the US, and that only if they would read the pamphlets or we could get them to trust us with some WhatsApp discussions would the outbreak stop. And that really, that supports a neoliberal notion of what a human agent is, that they have perfect information and perfect agency to make choices. But it really blames the victims of outbreaks for the propagation of them. Instead, if you really talk to the people and you understand that, the idea that Ebola is a US bioweapon is more a part of historical consciousness. It's actually a structured disposition towards eluding depredation that is based on 200 years of, King Leopold cutting off hands when people didn't get enough rubber, and Belgian extraction of gold and ivory and other resources, to the assassination of their first prime minister and Patrice Lumumba by Belgium and the US, to the US installing puppet Cold War dictator Mobutu, who just took a little bit of money in Kinshasa and allowed transnational companies to come pillage the very, very, very rich resources that DRC has. And then that continues into this day. AngloGold Ashanti in North Kivu, where I was working with the WHO on Ebola, they get about 93% of the wealth from the gold that's extracted out of the ground, leaving a paltry 7% for the country, which mostly goes to Kinshasa. And we showed in a paper in Sierra Leone that taxes from the diamond theft over the past 90 years, taxes from them alone would have built a health infrastructure that could have stopped Ebola in its tracks. And so, if you look at, if you get to structural determinants of outbreaks and see that in people's responses, the interventions become very different. So if it's their ignorance and their attitudes and practices that are the problem, then you give them pamphlets and WhatsApp groups and try to talk to chiefs to be your friend. If you see that it's legacies of colonialism that are actually structuring people's unwillingness to engage with new foreign invaders, essentially, then repair of those legacies is the intervention, essentially reparations. And so I'm chairing the Lancet Commission on Reparations and Redistributive Justice, and we have a section on Congo that is essentially gathers the evidence for reparations claims, and then makes recommendations, such that the U.S. and Belgium owe trillions of dollars to the DRC. Even in WHO meetings, I would go in and they would say, okay, the last village we went to, only 10% of people accepted the vaccine for Ebola. What do you think? And I'd say, let's get $100 million from Belgium and pay people to get the vaccine, but it has to be clear that that $100 million is just the first installment of the trillions that are owed for a larger reparations plan. And of course, I get laughed out of the room. But I'm serious in that, if you see the 1800s as the century of abolition and ending of slavery, and the 2000s, and the 1900s as the century of human rights discourse, development, and aid, that maybe the 2000s are the century of reparations. And I'll get into some of the work we've done on that in a little bit. And what I'm most interested in, though, is how people's perception continues to be colonized. Ngugi wa Thiong'o back in the 80s said that colonialism imposed its control of the social production of wealth through military conquest and subsequent political dictatorship. But its most important area of domination was the mental universe of the colonized, the control through culture of how people perceive themselves and their relationships to the world. And that's what I will argue, that that studies like this Harvard School of Public Health study actually commits symbolic violence by imposing a perception on people in this Ebola outbreak that they have themselves and their ignorance to blame, instead of the perception which they are offering, which is essentially that there are legacies of colonialism to blame that need to be repaired. Because these narratives do take off. So after this paper came out, I saw Ministry of Health people, WHO people saying, okay, wow, it really is this mistrust, this misinformation belief. We have to combat the misinformation, through changing attitudes and knowledge, attitudes and practice, through getting into the WhatsApp groups, instead of saying that no, we have to intervene on the actual risk structure, which would entail reparative justice. Some more terms used in the book: cultural hegemony. So if exploitative socioeconomic relations are indeed foundational to the social order, as they are in the US and as they are in our relations with countries in the global South, then this is likely to have a fundamental shaping effect on social ideation. And so to me, conducting public health research, is a form of, if it's social inquiry, then it's a form of social ideation, and it can't help but be influenced by dominant ideologies. Some of what I critique in the book, I label bourgeois empiricism, and Levitz and Lewontin had to say that. Models of disease causation that obscure socio-historical forces. So this disease causation model or narrative from Harvard School of Public Health is that people have ignorance to blame for disease causation. These are political acts. They give support to social structures that hide behind scientific objectivity to perpetuate dependency, exploitation, racism, elitism, and colonialism. And we're beyond like the sort of Trumpian post-truth, like lies and misinformation. They did collect facts, this group, but they curated them in such a way as to blame the individuals there. I also did a study that curated facts in my discussions with people, but there was an eye towards social and historical justice. And that's my point. I think with a lot of social inquiry, and especially with modeling, there can always be ideological predispositions that you have to be conscious of. And when I said that they committed some symbolic violence, here's the definition: that it can be thought of as the capacity to impose the means for comprehending and adapting to the social world by representing the economic and political world in disguise, taken for granted forms. And here's a paper on Ebola survivors in Sierra Leone, where we use this theory essentially to describe just the symbolic violence the word outbreak commits. So, even though my PhD is in anthropology, I guess I would consider myself more of a critical theorist. And a critical theorist essentially just takes the categories we use and shows that these are not really normal categories. They're not objective. They do work. And so outbreak, the word outbreak essentially implies that there is an amount of suffering from an infectious disease that kind of ends when transmission ends. And this paper was all about the post-Ebola suffering that kind of went on past the end of outbreak, where most of the NGOs left and all of the money that we were promised to rebuild social health systems left as well. I also use some détournement in the book, which is the kind of the artistic movement, neo-Marxist artistic movement in the 60s, that would take advertisements and posters and use the symbols that were kind of familiar to the public and rearrange them to make more, to deliver a different message. And so here, this was the poster in Sierra Leone that basically said, you get the virus, go to the health center. Once they found out that the health centers were amplifying transmission, they said, okay, call this 117, don't go to the health center, and we'll send somebody to you. But to me, this is the this was put out by UNICEF, and if this is the kind of narrative of like what people's understanding of the outbreak, you would be left thinking, okay, there's this entity called Ebola that makes me sick, and then I need to get help for it. Where I would posit, if you use different categories of thought, you could easily say that there is an entity called, legacies of colonialism, or mining companies in Kono district where I work that have taken all the diamonds without paying their taxes. That to me is a real pathology. Underdeveloped health centers that, because of this tax evasion, is a cause of this person's suffering. Here we have the barbaric colonialism, purposeful underdevelopment, epistemic violence. Here's a slide I like to show. Back in 2017, $162 billion came into the continent in the form of AIDS, loan, and remittances, and $200 billion came out in illicit financial flows. This purposeful underdevelopment stuff, like illegal theft of money. So the idea that there's development is a total farce. USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development. If the continent is a net creditor to the global north of $40 billion, then this idea of development is a farce. And we can look back as far as Kwame Nkrumah in the 1960s, who said that, the first president of Ghana, who said that, aid is really just a revolving door for extraction. You can give a little with one hand to disguise what you're taking with the right. And the thesis in the book is that actually a lot of what constitutes global public health science aids in this occulting of not only resource theft, but inability to combat or repair legacies of colonialism. I also use, the book is quite experimental. Like, I don't think you can critique modernity with using its terms of reference. And so each chapter, and they're not even called chapter, they're called redescriptions in true like pragmatist fashion, is a different heuristic. So there's everything from flash fiction to kind of reverse ethnography, to rewritten Platonic dialogues. And here's one where I do a network modeling exercise, where I just take data from previous studies and look and essentially do a study on Black women at high risk for HIV acquisition in South Africa, where control group incidence is 1% or 8% at a year. Compare that to the dapivirine ring, which showed whatever 20%, 27% efficacy, but showed no efficacy in the younger women, and then showed what it would look like if women were able to just change themselves into being white. And this is part of my critique of regression modeling, causal inference, big data, is that you oftentimes cannot get a variable that sums up, that is a well-defined sum up of all the structural determinants. In this case, I think only race change could do it, and that's why this is it's a critique and not a real study. Essentially, departing from Imperia's irony is, of course, incoherent to imagine people switching their race if race is conceived as an intersubjective construct. However, it can serve as a heuristic device to demonstrate the conservativity inherent in causal inference, because it's the only really well-defined intervention that you could sum up so many structural pathways of harm. And so here I will, I think I mentioned a little later on, one of your colleagues, Sharon Schwartz, her paper on is the well-defined assumption in causal inference conservative. That to me is one of the 5 best papers ever written that I've read across medicine, epidemiology, anthropology. It's fantastic. I think it gets right at the heart of what I'm trying to discuss today. Here I just throw the R code on there because I actually see these models as a form of rhetoric. And so to show people what different forms of rhetoric can look like, here's what the rhetoric to give an ironic network modeling study of a critique of causal inference this is what it actually looks like in different form. And so, you know, where I think we can all sort of evolve as social scientists is seeing ourselves not as, you know, the scientist whose job it is to set ourselves slightly ahead or slightly to one side in order to find these capital T truths about what's going on in the world, but rather to be more focused on how we are to struggle against these forms of power that we are both objects and instruments of. And I'll give some more examples of that. You know, you don't feel like reading the whole book. 2 of the chapters are exist as articles. This is the afterword, and it's in BMJ Global Health, where I essentially talk about, and this Ariel Rubinstein, who's an economist in Israel, says the same thing about economic models, that, you know, they are merely fables dressed in formal language, that therefore create the illusion of being scientific. And for the most part, for me, they serve not as forecasts, but rather as means for setting epistemic confines to the understanding of why some groups live sicker lives than others, confines that sustain predatory accumulation instead of challenging it. And I'll give some examples, mostly about IHME because it's so easy to critique. So here's a model of a group that I feel committed symbolic violence, not like I haven't, but, you know, I'm cherry picking these examples. This was a group out of Princeton that talked about spatial and temporal dynamics of super spreading events in the 2014 West Africa Ebola epidemic. And they used the word super spreader 38 times in this article. And to me, that is, you know, you could analyze, why does this guy here get called a super spreader? Who determined that this was the kind of active node in a long historical network of, you know, as the agent or the engine for the 5 people that were infected after him? How does he become the agent, the super spreader, the one that this paper says super spreaders drove Ebola epidemic? If we could only find these super spreaders beforehand, we could, you know, we could squash the epidemic in its tracks, you know. And so, yeah, when you critically analyze these categories, you know, is he a super spreader? Is he an Ebola patient? And that's using kind of a methodologically individualist approach. If you use the methodologically relationalist approach, you would actually not see them as either, but more as a personal protective equipment bereft care nexus. But even going further than that, you could see, again, the mining company as a super spreader. So, you know, taking the example in DRC in North Kivu, where 93% of the wealth was taken out of the ground, and if it had remained there, there could surely be enough money for health infrastructure to stop Ebola. How does that company not get called the super spreader? And I think they don't get called the super spreader because it's hard to give them a well-defined role as a super spreader, because we're so focused on how can we see, like, it's easy to see that this guy caused the next infection because the virus jumped from him to the next person. It's harder to see how AngloGold Ashanti caused infections to go on. And that's why I think we have to throw it away when it's that conservative a way of parsing health phenomena. We step back to a more determinative model, where one can clearly see by making these associations that they're, and through counterfactuals, that if there were another couple billion there that hadn't been taken, and that this had been used for health infrastructure, then, you know, they could have been like Nigeria, who was able to contain their outbreak pretty quickly because they actually had a very strong public health infrastructure in place. There's plenty of corruption and all that, but there were mechanisms in place to halt the spread there. So I essentially see epidemiology as a dispositif. I mean, you can see by this definition, which is Agamben's extension of Foucault's. He says that further expanding the already large class of Foucauldian apparatuses, I shall call an apparatus literally anything that has in some way the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, and secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on how COVID, this isn't in the book because it's newer, but how COVID models have done this. They have the capacity to capture people's imagination, orient them to a future where we may be headed, determine and control behaviors from masking to social distancing to closing down of schools, and securing this discourse through propagation through media and all of that. The book itself goes through critiques of each of these four paradigms, and as I said, this is my favorite article, and if those of you that haven't read it, it's brilliant. There's another critique of big data, and then in the rest of the slides, I'll show some critique of the regression models and epidemic modeling. So let's go after IHME because it's very easy to see how they are essentially transfer mechanisms for neoliberal philosophies. So Institute for Health Metrics, here's a good article in The Nation that just talks about, are Bill Gates' billions distorting public health data. If you give $600 million to an organization and you build their unit like right down the road from your house, you may have an outsized role in determining how we parse health phenomena. Well, let's focus on those IHME forecasts from back in the spring. So first of all, the true number of next day deaths fell outside of their prediction out of their 95% intervals 70% of the time. So they were completely wrong. Or, as Nassim Taleb would say, they're not even wrong, and we'll get to him. But their plunging projections were also used by the Trump administration to say that they were doing competent work. So they were easily co-opted for ideological purposes, in this case on the far right. And here's, if you're interested, there was a kind of debate, and many of you probably saw this on the web between Taleb and John Ioannidis, with Ioannidis saying, we just need more data, we just need better data. And Taleb saying, like, early on with these fat-tailed variables, there's so much uncertainty that you're never going to get to it. So why even waste the energy on going after that uncertainty? You should take the most paranoid path possible, which is what China and Japan and Sierra Leone and South Korea did, and contain the outbreak pretty quickly, instead of doing what Italy did or UK did, where you let it run and it ran. But even more, further than like being wrong or ideological, I actually think the work is racist. And this is essentially using Ibram Kendi's definition that racist work or policy or analyses is work that either adds to inequalities between races or continues the status quo. The only work that can be considered anti-racist is that which looks to decrease disparities or reduce inequalities. And so these forecasts, they really just talk about what happens if you wear masks, social distance, close down some schools. There's actually no intervention in risk structure. So even if we go from 3 million cases to 1 million cases because everybody follows this, in both scenarios, 3 times the amount of people of color are dying because there are no risk structure interventions built into it. And so therefore it's doing racist work because it's perpetuating status quo disparities. I think on top of it, they actively delimit through their exaggerated precision and acceptance of government interventions, as opposed to interventions in risk structure, as status quo, the public's ability to imagine social alternatives. And so part of what we were trying to do with some of our ancillary work on the Lancet Commission was to imagine what social alternatives would look like, what anti-racist modeling would look like. And so we published this paper, Reparations for American Descendants of Persons Enslaved in the US and Their Potential Impact on SARS-CoV-2 Commission. And it just came out, you can see, like a month ago. And here's the definition of racism that I was talking about. So race is a power construct of collected or merged difference that lives socially. A racist policy or analysis is any measure that produces or sustains. And I think that's the important thing. I think these models sustain racial inequity because they don't they don't allow the imaginary to even imagine either interventions into racial justice or in the risk structure. An anti-racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial equity. So the background of the paper: in the US, Black Americans are suffering significantly disproportionate incidents of COVID-19. So going beyond epidemiological tallying, the potential for racial justice interventions, including reparation payments to ameliorate these disparities, hasn't been adequately explored. And models, here's the point: models must make assumptions about how people interact with others, but they rarely account for social forces like institutional and cultural racism that structure such interactions. It's hard to enumerate these variables. Therefore, they can obfuscate such forces in their attempts to describe outbreak transmission dynamics. Just a quick word on our definition from our Lancet report on what reparations are: knowledge of a grievous injustice, redress for the injustice, and closure of the grievances held by the group subjected to that injustice. And our report has about 10 different cases from around the world, and each of them is headed by somebody that would essentially benefit from those reparations, a scholar that works in that area. In this one, we just focused on reparations for Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the US. And the way we did it was by considering a range of reproductive ratios, essentially by we compared Louisiana to South Korea, saying that Louisiana is sort of an archetypal segregated society that has a high proportion of people of color, at least Black people, but not Hispanics or Asians or Native Americans, so that we were able to do sort of a binary analysis. Plus they had some good COVID data. And then we compared that to South Korea, which we thought of as more an egalitarian society that does not have people that are descendants of former enslaved people. And then we basically modeled what the effect of monetary reparations would have on the actual descendants, but also on R0 as a whole, like as group transmission dynamics. And we just used next generation matrices. We kind of plugged in what we got as the higher R0 for, we did some Walinga Tunis and found that, the R0 at the beginning of the Louisiana outbreak was kind of in the 4s. And that's based on the fact that, R0 is not a intrinsic quality of a pathogen. It actually builds in social structure into it. So the social structure in Louisiana is one such that this variable here, the transmission rate between Black people, is quite high compared to the rest of these. And because the diagonal of this eigenstructure can dominate the value of R0, having a high risk group really can shoot this number up. And so essentially what we did was back calculate these transmission rates using our kind of predetermined ideas of what R0 might be, with the assumption that this was going to be much greater than this, which was than the white to white, which was going to be much greater than this, which is just a little bit greater than this. So we had an order of what we thought the transmission rates would be highest, because the transmission rate is made from a contact rate and transmissibility. So a lot of this is based just on the contact rate that, just through census data, we're able to show that Black people in Louisiana live in much more overcrowded housing, meaning over one person per room. And so reasoning through the consequences of increased equity via matrix transmission models, we demonstrated how the benefits of a social reparations, a successful reparations program, could have reflected in this ratio, which I'll show you in the next slide, could have reduced R0 for the general population by 30 to 60%. And so we conclude that a restitutive program targeted towards Black individuals not only decrease COVID risk for recipients of this redistribution, but the mitigating effects would be distributed across racial groups, benefiting the population at large. Here's what I talked about when we did our initial findings of what was R0 for Louisiana compared to a more egalitarian place, and reasoned that the inegalitarian social structure is built into the initial R0, because this is before, right, any interventions take place. And what we found that is assuming that, with contact rates being very high, that the ratio of transmission among Black people compared to whites is 4 to 5 times higher. This gives you that R naught in the range of 4. And that by reducing, and so the idea is kind of just sort of simple, it's like a thought experiment, that if you were able to reduce people's risk structure to near parity, it's like where this gets to 1, or even above 1, say it's 1.5 because it's hard to get rid of some of the legacies, then you get down to an R naught for the general population of just above 2. And I'll add, I forgot to say in the methods, that this is a reparations program that has been promoted by the Duke economist Sandy Darity and has a huge following, that reparations in the US should take the form of eradicating the wealth gap between Black and white people. And that wealth gap is currently $10 trillion, which actually amounts to $200,000 per 40 million, 10 million. So $250,000, I guess, per 40 million descendants of people enslaved in the US. What would be the mechanisms by which this could work? It would narrow the path-dependent racial wealth divide, so essentially repairing all of the historical social structure that led to this wealth divide. To changes in the built environment, so that people aren't overcrowding and that they actually have the ability to social distance. Frontline would actually be spread across racial groups, so B to B would not be as high, and then decreased race-based allostatic load. If you believe that there is that some of the mortality we're seeing is due to an amount of allostatic load on patients that have experienced racism, then then this is potentially one of the mechanisms. Although I think, in looking at more recent data, and this was our hypothesis back, we started writing this back in April and May, and it got denied at many places. And it didn't get denied because of the models. They always came back and said, the models are great. It's such a huge assumption to think that $10 trillion would achieve equity. Or, I mean, to us, it was kind of racism built into peer review, that, again, we can't imagine beyond incremental interventions to do our counterfactuals. And so we conclude that since reparations had not been enacted, though, reopening of American society, we predicted would have a disproportionate adverse mortality effect, but we didn't get published until after that happened. So this effect was predictable. And so it's kind of, you want to be radical, you could say it's Tuskegee in a way. We knew that there were disparities, and we didn't do any racial, risk structure interventions, and we opened up early without any of these interventions. And so lastly, the appalling evidence of racism embodied as disproportionate COVID incidents should add to moral, historical, and legal arguments for reparations for descendants of people enslaved. Now, this actually made it into CNN. The paper got an alt metric of like 500 right now. I have received huge amounts of hate mail, enormous amounts, and totally racist hate speech. It's rather disturbing. No threats on my life, but disturbing racist hate speech. And it's still coming in. So that's that part. One more critique just on meta-regressions that done by the IHME. It's essentially comes to how you choose your variables. I think in the study or in the book, I give a quick example of how you take this one study out of Stanford that showed that USAID money was good, floats all boats, it reduces under 5 mortality in recipient countries that receive it. All you had to do was add another variable for illicit financial flows to show that those gains are offset in countries where there are huge amounts of illicit financial flows. And so it's a very political choice picking your variables, and you can come up with very different answers and support very different ideological purposes. So the Stanford study supports USA continuing to be sort of this handmaiden of post-colonial extraction, and the guys that wrote it are known for being neoliberal. They're the ones who did this same COVID studies that essentially partnered with the guy from JetBlue, took money to really show that we shouldn't be closing down American society. So for me, it's very easy to see, and I guess because I'm trained in it, like ideology built into studies, especially like the Stanford stuff that makes it so easy. here, in these global burden of disease studies, I think the problem is just the choice of downstream variables. You know, really, if you can say that in this study, the top 3 causes of death, you know, so the top 3 causes of people suffering around the world are whatever, it's like alcohol, tobacco, and hypertension, you know, really guts the upstream determinants of why people live sicker lives in the global south. You know, even say Ambibola, who's the chief editor-in-chief of BMJ Global Health, tweeted, you know, is it even ethical to publish these global burden of disease studies? Because it really imposes this downstream understanding of global health suffering. And in so doing, perpetuates these, you know, technical Gates interventions instead of moving it back upstream, which would, you know, get us to much more reparative interventions. And so if IHME's mission is to improve the health of world population by providing the best information on population health, to me, that's somewhat like saying if they existed back in the, you know, 17th and 19th centuries and they went around plantations and they said, okay, counted up how many people died from strokes, heart attacks, and malnutrition on plantations, and then wrote those numbers like we're giving the best information on, you know, mortality, why these people died. There's no analysis of power. With that analysis of power, you perpetuate status quo inequalities. And so I basically conclude that we can trace human rights failings to some of the impoverished discursive infrastructure of objectivist epidemiology. And if we change these things, we actually transform global health by just transforming how we represent it, how we impose understandings of health phenomena on people that aren't part of the academy or don't have the research apparatus to be, you know, dominating the narratives. So with that, I will say thank you. If there's any questions that come up or want any more discussion afterwards, please feel free to email me, but it would be great to open